Section 10.3, the theory of natural selection. The key idea for Darwin's theory of natural selection is that he proposed a mechanism for evolution. This idea of natural selection was a mechanism, or actually how evolution happened. Before that, people had kind of some ideas, but they didn't really get to the point of saying, this is how it's happening. So Darwin was a naturalist, meaning he studied nature. And he spent more than 20 years doing research, looking at results from what farmers were doing, as well as breeders at home, and also in his travels around the world. Since he was a keen observer of nature, he noticed a lot of variation among plants, domestic plants, and animals that weren't shown in the wild relatives, or those naturally occurring organisms in nature. Artificial selection is a process by which humans change a species by breeding for certain traits or specific traits that they're looking for. In this case, humans are the selective agent for determining which traits are favorable. Investing in this, he turned to studying the breeding of pigeons, and he looked at all the different types of pigeons and what particular traits they had, either colorization or body type or feathering. And he would found that some of these, or that these traits were heritable, meaning they could be inherited from their parents. Okay, artificial selection would mean he would be breeding those to get that specific trait passed on to the next generation. In order for a trait to be heritable, it has to be passed on to the next generation. Artificial selection is used a lot for crops, food crops, as well as for certain flowers that are bred or produced just to given out, like hybrid roses, long-stem roses, and certain stuff like that. They're produced to have a particular shape, color, style, look to them that would be desirable for people to purchase. Natural selection is when nature, the environment, acts as a selective agent. The environment determines which traits are favorable. Natural selection was Darwin's idea that the mechanism by which individuals that have inherited beneficial adaptations produce more offspring than others. If you have a trait that helps you survive in nature, you're better able to pass that on to your offspring than an organism that wouldn't have those same beneficial adaptations. The struggle for survival came from an economist named Thomas Malthus. Okay, he proposed that since resources are limited, these limits on natural resources would actually affect the population's growth. All populations produce more offspring than the environment can support, because the species is going to want to survive. So you're going to give more than the environment can support. Food, water, shelter would all be things that organisms would need in order to live. And because these resources are scarce, it keeps populations small. So these ideas led Darwin to ask, how come some individuals survive and some don't? The answer was found in the variation within populations. A population is all the individuals of a specific species that live in an area. Okay, on Darwin's voyage, he noticed some species had variations that were better suited for the environment in which they lived. He proposed that these adaptations arose over many generations, which he called descent with modification. Descent meaning coming from a common ancestor, but modification because they are adapting. They're taking these traits that were best suited for their environment and passing them off to their offspring. So over time, that becomes more of the norm. Darwin developed these four main principles to explain evolution by means of natural selection. Remember, this was the mechanism that he proposed. First, there was variation within the population, within the species. Heritable differences that exist are the basis for natural selection. Differences are the result of different genetic material. Remember, the genes, the genotype, determines the phenotype, the physical expression of these traits. Okay, so that's the first thing, is variation. Overproduction, more offspring increases competition for resources, but it also increases the chance of organisms surviving. It brings competition into the population, but then the best adapted, the best suit for that environment will have the best chance of survival. Adaptation would be a variation that may allow an individual to survive better than others in their present environment. Thus, they're going to live longer, and if they live longer, they can produce more offspring that would have that same adaptation passed down to those progeny. And last thing is descent with modification. More individuals will have the adaptation in the following generations because that would give it an advantage over those organisms of the same species that didn't have this adaptation. Okay, this slide just kind of shows these four principles in action. Overproduction, okay, over here, there's a lot of organisms, all different types. It's variation. There's big ones, there's little ones, there's darker, there's lighter, okay? That'd be overproduction. Okay, variation, the individuals of the population have characteristics that differ. Obviously, these guys are different. And then there's selection. And here it shows that these guys aren't doing so well. They're not taking a nap. They're dead. For whatever reason, they did not have the survival skills necessary to handle this environment. And descent with modification is over time, if you look at this population, most of them have these same traits that adaptation allowed for them to survive. There's still a few, right? These guys, a few, that have this less advantageous trait, but it's not going to be as prevalent because it's not giving them a better advantage. Okay, biological fitness is an organism's ability to survive and produce more offspring relative to other members of the population. The best fit organisms for that environment. That doesn't say they're going to be the biggest, strongest, fastest organisms. It just says at that time, at that place, they are the best fit organisms for that environment. Natural selection acts on existing variation. Natural selection is determined by phenotypes, or it's working on the phenotypes rather than the genotypes or the genetic material. New alleles aren't made through natural selection, they're made through mutations. Okay, so natural selection has nothing to do with mutations other than if that mutation that already happened was beneficial to the species, then that mutation would be passed on in higher numbers, and as a result, the organisms would tend to start having this in a higher incidence. A trait that's already in an environment can become more favorable if the environment changes. As the environment changes, different traits may become favorable. A trait that was advantageous today may not be so in the future.